The Akatsuki are one of the most infamous villain groups in not only Naruto, but also all of anime. Yet nowadays it feels more like they're more often than not being disrespected than respected. Now, unfortunately, this kind of thing is going to happen when every single one of your members dies some kind of horrific death, and also the universe you're supposed to take over massively outscales you the second you're gone. And thus, unfortunately, nowadays, whenever the Akatsuki are brought up, it seems as though they're only brought up to fight in somewhat ridiculous versus battles. Whether that be against each other, individual members of the Akatsuki fighting against people they never saw, or maybe weren't even alive at the same time as, or in the worst case scenarios, the entirety of the Akatsuki versus somebody who is way more powerful than each individual member. And well, unfortunately for the Akatsuki, that last one's exactly what we're doing here today. Because today, I want to answer a question that's been floating around the interwebs for years now. Today, I want to put to bed who would win in a fight between the Akatsuki and Hashirama. Yes, you heard me right, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are talking Hashirama versus the entirety of the Akatsuki simultaneously. A death battle that's sure to be a lot closer than even you realize. But before we get to starting this 10v1, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional NC Hammer 23 video every single week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We are on to Neji versus Hinata, and things are, well, they're not looking great for Hinata. See, I'm gonna be real. For a lot of you, this probably sounds like a completely absurd hypothetical fight. I mean, after all, the Akatsuki were the group of notorious villains in Naruto who were able to bring about the Eye of the Moon plan, even though they all did die in the process. So surely, if all 10, and yes, we're including Orochimaru, members of the Akatsuki worked together, they'd be able to rather easily defeat Hashirama, right? I mean, he's just one man. And the Akatsuki have knocked off some very impressive fighters before. However, this fight is a lot closer than you think. And in order to establish just how close this fight actually is, we have to paint the picture of exactly how strong everyone involved is and understand how their weaknesses may turn into strengths or how their strengths might expose other people's weaknesses. So in order to begin the painting of this rather large image, let's start talking about the strengths and the weaknesses of every single member of the Akatsuki from weakest to strongest. That is to say, let's establish how strong they are and how their kits would be advantageous in a battle against Hashirama. And thus the first member of the Akatsuki we're going to be talking about, because he is undoubtedly the weakest member of the Akatsuki, is Hidan. That's not an opinion, it's a fact. However, even though Hidan is the weakest member of the Akatsuki, that does not mean he's weak. He's still insanely strong, actually. See, ignoring the whole immortality thing for just one moment, and I know that's a big ignore on account of the fact that it's basically his entire kit, Hidan kind of boils down to a Kenjutsu and Taijutsu specialist. That is to say that outside of his blood ritual that allows for him to transfer any wound he does to himself over to whoever's blood he's consumed, we never see him use anything even remotely close to ninjutsu. So Hidan's entire kit kind of boils down to one ability. Now, it is a great ability. However, once you understand how Hidan's kit works, he's kind of cooked. Once Shikamaru understood that Hidan needed his blood in order to kill him, he was able to do exactly what you should do if you're fighting against Hidan. Keep distance, and if you can, trick him into believing that he's taken your blood when in actuality it's somebody else's. Now, if we're being real, in a battle between Hashirama and Hidan does start at a kind of advantage, in the same way that Hidan starts at an advantage against anybody he fights against. See, because as Hidan is the only pure-blooded Joshinist in existence, Hashirama would have no reason to understand how Hidan's abilities work. And therefore, if at any point during this fight against the entirety of the Akatsuki, if either Hidan or any other member of the Akatsuki cuts Hashirama and gets his blood, Hidan can use that blood to inflict grievous wounds on Hashirama. And you might be thinking to yourself right there, well, that sounds like a win condition, and technically you're not really wrong. Yeah, basically all the Akatsuki needs to do is get some of Hashirama's blood, get that blood to Hidan, let him lick it, and then he can just start stabbing himself in the chest repeatedly. However, how repeatedly Hidan's actually able to stab himself in the chest, we don't know. We do know that he's immortal, but like his wounds do need to be healed. However, considering the fact that Hashirama would have to contend with 9 other members of the Akatsuki, if Hidan, whose ability doesn't have an effective range that we're aware of, was able to get Hashirama's blood and scamper away while the other 9 members of the Akatsuki were to hold him off, there's a good shot that Hidan would be able to at least slow down Hashirama a fair amount. See, because here's the thing, Hashirama's healing capability has been compared to that of Tsunade using mitotic regeneration without the hand seals. That is to say, if hypothetically Hashirama was stabbed through the heart, it probably wouldn't kill him. He'd heal from the wound all but immediately. However, while the hole in his heart was healing, Hashirama would be slowed. He could even be stopped directly in his tracks. And if Hashirama is slowed down by a flurry of injuries being imparted onto him by Hidan, who technically doesn't have to be anywhere near him and therefore could be out of the reach of Hashirama from grabbing him and stopping him from doing any more damage to him, that could allow for the stronger members of the Akatsuki to dive in on top of him and finish him off. And thus this begs the question, could Hidan or anybody in the Akatsuki draw blood from Hashirama? Well, I can tell you right now, it won't be Hidan. Yes, Hidan was able to trade blows with an early Shippuden Kakashi, and yes, he was established to be much stronger than Asuma, who was chosen as one of the 12 pillars of the Land of Fire, specifically chosen to protect the daimyo, which implies that on some level, Asuma was one of the 12 strongest fighters in the Land of Fire. Now, these two feats alone mean that Hidan's AP is somewhere in the region of city level, and considering the fact that he was able to keep up not only with Asuma, but also an early Shippuden Kakashi, means that his speed is somewhere in the region of sub-relativistic. However, even with impressive sounding stats like that, that's not going to allow for Hidan to get literally anywhere near Hashirama. So the blood from Hashirama has to come from somewhere else. And maybe that somewhere else will be our next member of the Akatsuki we're going to talk about, Sasori. Oh, Nick, shouldn't it be Konan? No, it shouldn't be Konan. Konan beat Sasori in a fight. And yes, I know it happens in a video game, and therefore it's technically non-canon, but Kishimoto co-writes all of the video games. And this is technically the only explanation we have for how Sasori ended up in the Akatsuki. So far as I'm concerned, in a 1v1, Konan beat Sasori. But anyways, what can Sasori do in this fight? Well, not much. See, some people, at least in my opinion, scale Sasori way too high, on account of the fact that Sasori killed the third Kazekage, and the third Kazekage is often talked about as the strongest Kazekage in the history of the sand. And therefore, as the third Kazekage is talked about as being the strongest Kazekage in the history of the sand, people believe that the third Kazekage must have been stronger than even the strongest iterations of Gaara we ever see in Naruto. And listen, this isn't the craziest idea of all time, because the third Kazekage had access to iron sand, which is still, to this day, deep into Boruto, the strongest jutsu to come out of the hidden sand. However, literally, anybody with a brain understands that Gaara by the end of Shippuden is much stronger than the third Kazekage could have ever possibly been. Why? Oh, I don't know, because Sasori was able to kill him. This is also important on account of the fact that after Sasori kills the third Kazekage, he turns him into a puppet who retains the iron sand technique. And that third Kazekage puppet becomes one of the strongest in Sasori's 300 puppet arsenal. However, Sasori's 300 puppet arsenal is barely a match for Granny Chiyo using effectively 11 puppets, her 10 Chikamatsu puppets, and Sakura. And Granny Chiyo's 10 Chikamatsu puppets are talked about as being powerful to take down an entire castle by themselves. And taking down an entire castle isn't necessarily the most impressive feat when talking about things that happen in the Naruto universe. And here's the thing, while Sasori was fighting a 1v2 against one of the greatest puppet users of all time in his grandmother, Granny Chiyo, and a post-time skip training Sakura, who was a legitimate threat coming out of the time skip, and he did decide to kill himself in the end, a pre-strength of 100 Sakura and an 85-year-old puppet master were enough to counter his strengths. And even if he did take himself out of that battle, they were at the very least an even match for him. Now, with all that said, Sasori does pretty easily scale to island level AP, and on account of the fact that he was able to, without looking, dodge an attack from a Kurama-influenced Naruto during the Shippuden bridge arc, implies that he is faster than Hidan, who also admits that he's the slowest out of the Akatsuki, and therefore he is sub-relativistic to possibly relativistic speeds. But with all that said, what does Sasori bring to this fight? Well, two things: volume and poison. Unfortunately, those two things are two things that probably wouldn't affect Hashirama all that much. See, it's a well-noted fact that Tsunade spent the majority of her time whenever she was involved in one of the great Shinobi World Wars counteracting the poison of Granny Chiyo, which implies that the poisons used by Granny Chiyo and Sasori can be countered. Considering the fact that Hashirama was probably better at medical ninjutsu, at least on himself, than Tsunade was for anyone, including herself, it stands to reason that basically any poison that was injected into his body would be metabolized almost instantly. And as for the volume, aka the 300 puppets that Sasori is able to control, destroying these puppets would be like crushing ants to Hashirama. They would legitimately be no challenge. So as for what Sasori brings to this battle, nothing, really. Hashirama would kill him in mere moments. Now, after Sasori, we do unfortunately have Konan. And Konan, unfortunately, is only ever involved in 2 canon fights, one of which she had Batman level prep time to get ready for. And furthermore, unfortunately for Konan, the best indicator of her true level of strength, that is to say that the strength that she actually has in a fight where she doesn't have weeks to prepare for somebody whose ability she understands perfectly to fall into a series of traps, is Konan's battle against Jiraiya, which is, well, Anticlimactic. See, a non-Sage Mode Jiraiya enters into a 1v1 against Konan. And while Konan is able to beat back his fire release using her dance the Shikigami, which is impressive considering the fact that it's paper versus fire, Jiraiya just rolls out of the way of the paper barrage, hits her with a Toad oil bomb, and then grabs her with his hair. And if it weren't for the intervention of the animal path after Jiraiya grabbed her, that probably would have been wraps for Konan. And while losing to Jiraiya is hardly a mark against you, Jiraiya didn't even struggle. He was never injured, he was never pressed, he didn't use Sage Mode, he didn't call Ma and Pa. He used like his 3 most basic jutsu and Konan was defeated. And while yes, Konan is able to injure Obito, I mean, she literally blows off one of his arms. Unfortunately, it's not really Konan injuring Obito. I mean, like, yes, she's the one who puts the explosive seals in amongst her paper that makes up her body. And she was absolutely the one who made this strategy because she understood how Obito's abilities work, which speaks to her level of genius, which is often undersold. But like Konan blowing off Obito's arm using explosive seals is more the explosive seal and less the Konan. It speaks more to her intellect than it does her AP. However, though, Konan is able to produce 600 billion paper bombs and literally split an entire lake or maybe small ocean that she casts Obito down into to his presumed death. And controlling these 600 billion paper bombs is technically an extension of her Dance of the Shikigami ability. And therefore, on account of the fact that this jutsu should have killed Obito, and on account of the fact that she was able to blow off one of his arms, a lot of people do end up saying that Konan's AP is somewhere in the region of small country level. Ties into the fact that she was able to react to and dodge and or block attacks from both Sasori and Jiraiya, and like all the other Akatsuki members you talked about up until this moment, her speed falls somewhere in the region of sub-relativistic. However, unfortunately for Konan, this high-end estimation of her AP can really only happen with an extraordinary amount of prep time and a deep understanding of her opponent. But it does show if hypothetically Konan was given enough time and was given a window to attack Hashirama, she could do a fair bit of damage. So that's what she brings to the equation. Out of all of the members of the Akatsuki, she has one of the most impressive damaging feats. And therefore, it's not crazy to say that Konan packs one of the bigger punches in the Akatsuki. Now, after Konan, we have an addition that a lot of other people probably wouldn't have added onto this list, but I'm trying to help the Akatsuki out here, because after Konan, we have Akatsuki Orochimaru, who we, unfortunately know basically nothing about. Pretty much the only battle that Akatsuki Orochimaru has ever shown being in is the battle he has against Itachi, which isn't even really a battle. Itachi literally no diffs Orochimaru to the point where Orochimaru has to break their own finger to break out of Genjutsu because they're about to be consumed by Itachi. Now, obviously, we know prior to joining the Akatsuki, Orochimaru was at least powerful enough to survive a battle against Hanzo the Salamander and get the title of the legendary Sannin. We know that all 3 of the Sannin are actively compared to each other in terms of strength, and that Orochimaru was in active consideration for the role of the 4th Hokage, meaning that around that time, he was probably comparably powerful to Minato. We also know that Anbu Kakashi stood no chance against them. However, with all that in mind, it is still kind of difficult to pinpoint exactly how powerful this version of Orochimaru is. See, we know that Orochimaru was still engaging in unethical human experimentation, which is what got them driven out of Konoha in the first place. We know that they had created Yamato, they'd given Danzo Shin Uchiha's arm. However, Orochimaru was still years away from perfecting Edo Tensei. So unfortunately for Orochimaru, the idea of them busting out any Edo Tensei soldiers probably shouldn't even be considered for this fight. So how powerful is this iteration of Orochimaru? I don't know, like maybe 3/4 as powerful as the version that fought against Hiruzen. So let's say city to island level AP with sub-relativistic speeds. And unfortunately for Orochimaru, really nothing that is threatening to Hashirama, like at all. They would have Manda, Kusanagi Blade, they'd be able to stretch out their arms and neck. Nothing that's gonna be of any consequence to Hashirama. So unfortunately, Orochimaru is barely even taken into consideration in this fight. Though knowing Orochimaru, they probably survive. However, after Orochimaru, we have the first actual person who could maybe kill Hashirama, because up next we have Deidara. Now, Deidara is engaged in a bunch of pretty impressive fights, like his battle against Garo, where he was able to claim victory by making a C2 bomb so large that it was going to wipe out the entirety of the Sand Village, and therefore, instead of protecting himself, Garo elected to protect the village. And considering the fact that Deidara was going to be able to wipe out an entire ninja village with just one attack, that puts Deidara very easily at city level plus AP. But Deidara's by far and away most impressive battle is his last battle, or at least his last battle while he was still alive. His battle against Sasuke, where he showed us his 2 most impressive moves, C4 and C0. Now, C4, for those of you who don't know, allows for Deidara to inflate an explosive clay clone until it pops like a balloon into millions of microscopic and very breathable little explosive Deidaras. And thus, anybody who inhales any of this explosive clay disintegrates immediately. The other most impressive move we saw from Deidara was his C0, a technique that cost Deidara his life, but also unveils his biggest ever explosion. An explosion so large that it's been rather consistently out to be somewhere in the region of small country level plus. However, there's two problems, one for each jutsu. The first problem being that Hashirama knows every single one of the elemental releases, including lightning release. And if Sasuke can figure out how to annul the effects of C4 by electrocuting his entire body and therefore nullifying the explosive release of the explosive clay in his body, I would bet you my entire bank account Hashirama could do the same. And the second problem is that Sasuke was able to survive C0 by summoning Manda to him and making Manda eat the explosion, which killed Manda. And being wrapped up in Mandas enough to survive a C0 explosion, then Hashirama's wood domes, which have survived tailed beast balls from the full version of Kurama, would also very easily be able to survive a C0 explosion. So unfortunately, Deidara also kind of brings nothing to the equation here. Now, I'm not saying that if Hashirama was put in some kind of disadvantageous situation that C4 or C0 could not kill him, that is, say if he wasn't prepared, but there's really nothing that tells us that if Hashirama had the time to react to either a C4 or a C0, he wouldn't survive it. However, even though Deidara doesn't bring anything to the table, maybe our next Akatsuki member, Kakuzu, does. Let me just stop me right there. No, he doesn't. Hashirama beat the brakes off Kakuzu literally so bad he had to leave his village. There is nothing that Kakuzu can do that Hashirama cannot do 100 times better. Any elemental release, taijutsu, long-range attacks, or regeneration that Kakuzu has access to, Hashirama has the clear advantage every single time. Kakuzu is a glorified taijutsu merchant who can split into elemental clones so weak that 10-10 is able to destroy them. And yes, she had the Basho-sen, but still, Kakuzu isn't even a distraction. He's not buying you 10 seconds against Hashirama. It's over, it's wraps, he's done, pack it up, all four hearts shattered, go to bed zombie duo. But Nick, how about we start talking about the real members of the Akatsuki, those with actual strength, like, you know, Kisame. And yeah, when we get to the Kisame level of the Akatsuki, that is to say the top 4 members, things do start to get a little bit more interesting. I mean, after all, Kisame is comparable to literally only one other person in the history of Naruto when it comes to water release, and that would be Hashirama's little brother, Tobirama. However, unfortunately for Kisame, he has not only acknowledged the fact that he is weaker than Itachi multiple times, and Itachi does not touch the power of a peak power Madara with a 10-foot pole, but even if, hypothetically, Kisame did bust out his strongest move, which is fusing with Samehada and covering the entire battlefield in water, like he did in his battle against Killer Bee and my guy, and Kisame was able to effectively trap Hashirama inside of this water bubble, Hashirama's true 1,000 hands Bodhisattva is bigger than a large mountain. I mean, it literally dwarfs Kurama. It's so big, it dwarfs the mountains around it. I'm not kidding. Cody, show an image of True 1000 Hands from the manga. The mountains around this jutsu are knee-high on the Bodhisattva. It is estimated to be somewhere in the region of 3,000 meters tall. That's more than 10,000 feet. Yes, obviously, Kisame was able to cover an entire forest in a big old water bubble that even Killer Bee couldn't swim out of. But there is no way that he has the ability to cover the entirety of the 1,000 Hands Bodhisattva in water. And even if he did, all of the hands are extendable. Hashirama could still sit on top of it and punch Kisame in his own water. And let's not forget that wood release is half water release. And while I do admit that Samehada would be useful in this battle against Hashirama because somebody has to chip away at his ridiculous chakra reserves, there's a fair to decent chance that the second that Samehada got a taste of Hashirama's chakra, it would switch sides. Also, in order to siphon off Hashirama's chakra, Hashirama would have to be cut. And we've already established that if the Akatsuki managed to cut Hashirama, that's kind of already their win condition. So ultimately, at the end of the day, Kisame does nothing. He'd be like a good Kenjutsu match for a non-Sage Mode Hashirama. Because I'd like to remind all of you that Hashirama is a Kenjutsu master. And every single one of the squabbles we've ever seen him have with Madara, he's usually got an entire scroll full of weapons waiting to be used. But the second that Hashirama busts out Sage Mode or any kind of wood release, bye, Kisame, your shark fin soup. But what about the person that Kisame openly admitted was stronger than him? Itachi. I mean, he's got the Totsuka blade, he's got Tsukiyomi, he's got Amaterasu, he's got the Yada mirror. And yeah, he does have all those things. And he is by far and away the fastest combatant we've talked about yet. I mean, he was able to speed blitz KCM1 Naruto and Killer Bee. He is easily FTL. Not to mention he was able to be 1/3 of the power that was able to destroy a peak power Tabaku Tensai from Edo Nagato. And he was able to manhandle a Dragon Sage Kabuto. His AP at peak power scales very easily to somewhere in the region of small country level. If you, of course, take into account his Edo feats, which I'm going to be doing, which is technically an advantage for Itachi because Itachi was at his strongest while he was in Edo Tensai form. And I'm going to be taking his and Nagato's feats into account account here, because I'm going to be taking Hashirama's Edo feats into account here, and that's a massive advantage for both Nagato and Itachi on account of the fact that Hashirama came back weaker as an Edo Tensei form, but both Nagato and Itachi came back stronger. However, unfortunately for Itachi, Hashirama literally cut his teeth fighting against the ghost of the Uchiha. And if you don't think that Madara had access to insanely high-level genjutsu, you're fooling yourself. Every Sharingan user at least has access to the base version of Sharingan genjutsu, which scales up in strength as their Sharingan progresses through its numerous forms. And while Madara did say that his Sharingan was similar to that of Sasuke, who we do rarely see use genjutsu, that doesn't mean he can't use genjutsu at an insanely high level. Sasuke literally out-genjutsus one of the few remaining members of the Shinoiki clan who have a Kekkei Genkai that boosts their genjutsu ability. And thus, either genjutsu didn't work against Hashirama, or Hashirama knew how to avoid genjutsu when fighting against a Sharingan user, because so far as we know, Madara never tries to use genjutsu on Hashirama. As for Amaterasu, not only could Hashirama very easily dodge Amaterasu, it's been dodged by people much slower than him. Any part of Hashirama that's hit by Amaterasu, we could just cut off and regrow. His healing factor was better than Tsunade's with the strength of 100 seal and mitotic regeneration. And as for Itachi's Susanoo weapons, they are, minus his Magatama, unfortunately all short range. And considering the fact that Hashirama could strip Madara's perfect Susanoo off Kurama, I'd say that Itachi's not even humanoid Susanoo stands no chance. So when it boils down to it, Itachi is nothing more than a possible finishing move on Hashirama using the Totsuka blade. Now, after Itachi is where we finally get our first real competitor in Nagato, who will unfortunately, for him, have to do the majority of the heavy lifting in this battle. See, a crippled Nagato using his Deva Path was able to flatten Konoha, the biggest out of any of the hidden villages in the Naruto universe, and his Shibaku Tensei was able to overpower a six-tailed version of Naruto, and was only broken when Naruto awoke to 8 tails of Kurama, almost fully manifesting him, meaning that his AP is easily the strongest out of anyone we've talked about today, clocking in at a whopping country level. Ties into the fact that Edo Nagato could keep up with KCM1 Naruto, and his speed is relativistic. And considering the fact that it took the combined power of an Edo Itachi, Killer Bee, and Naruto to destroy Chibaku Tensei from Edo Nagato, it's not crazy to assume that Nagato's Chibaku Tensei could kill Hashirama, as Hashirama's peak strength is often compared to KCM2 Naruto. However, unfortunately for Nagato, a reincarnated version of Madara with infinite chakra, infinite regeneration, 2 Rinnegan, and Hashirama's cells still lost to a weaker than peak Hashirama. Oh, but Nick, Edo Hashirama still has all the benefits of Edo Tensei. I mean, like infinitely refilling chakra and infinite regeneration, the 2 things that he already had while he was alive. So how do I think that Nagato would fare in a battle against somebody who was able to beat a stronger version of him, who not only had access to the Rinnegan, but also access to the Sharingan and all of its Mangekyo Sharingan abilities? Not well. However, with the introduction of Chibaku Tensei, we have maybe the first straight-up jutsu that could kill Hashirama if used correctly. However, that does raise the question why Madara didn't try to use Chibaku Tensei against Hashirama, when we know damn well that he had access to it. Was it because he didn't want to? Was it because he knew it wouldn't work? Well, we can't really say. But if Madara didn't try to use one of his stronger abilities against his eternal rival, it kind of tells you everything you need to know about the effectiveness of that jutsu against said eternal rival. Now, Nagato's chakra absorption ability could become slightly problematic. However, I'm not entirely sure that the chakra absorption ability of the Rinnegan would work against wood release, on account of the fact that wood release is a physical construct and not a true elemental release like lightning release or fire release or a Rasengan. You know, the kind of things that we see often absorbed by the absorption ability of the Rinnegan. I believe that Momoshiki's Rinnegan palms have once absorbed wood release, if I'm not mistaken, but he's an Otsutsuki, and who's to say that his ability works exactly the same as Nagato's? And even if hypothetically Nagato is able to absorb wood release, there's still things like the poisonous gases created by deep forest emergence that he wouldn't be able to absorb because they're not chakra related. They're real life poisons created by real life trees. But after Nagato, coming up last, but certainly not least, we have Obito, or more specifically, Toby. So the version of Obito with 1 Kamui Eye and 1 spare Sharingan to use for a possible Izanagi. Now this version of Obito, even though it is not the strongest version of Obito by a landslide, is still crazy powerful. Kamui is ridiculously broken. However, several people who are weaker and almost undoubtedly less combat savvy than Hashirama have figured out the weaknesses of Kamui. Konan was able to find not only 1, but 2 separate ways to kill Obito, overriding his Kamui abilities. And Minato is able to deduce the weaknesses of Kamui on the the fly after battling against it for the first ever time. And while Hashirama would have a lot to worry about in this 10v1, Hashirama is one of the most powerful Senso ninjas of all time, and thus he'd be able to deduce that Obito is the strongest member of the Akatsuki, and thus he would dedicate the majority of his resources to making sure that Obito was put down for good. And while Hashirama may not have Minato's speed, he does have access to an attack volume that Minato couldn't dream of. In fact, Obito literally admits in his battle against Konan, when Konan launches a flurry of paper against him, that her strategy to overwhelm him with volume in hopes that when he rematerializes, she catches him with a piece of paper is actually a good idea. Ties into the fact that Deep Force Emergence is able to cover an entire battlefield in poisonous gas that worked so immediately that it was going to wipe out all 5 of the Kage simultaneously, and you have to take into account the fact that if Obito were to try and warp away, he would actually be taking a fair amount of this poisonous gas with him back to the kamui dimension, making it impossible to breathe in either dimension. On top of this, Toby himself doesn't necessarily have what I would identify as a killer move, or at least a killer move that could kill Hashirama. He has high defense, speed, and maneuverability, but not until he gets one Rinnegan does he begin to display moves that could hypothetically kill Hashirama. And yes, he is technically the only member of the Akatsuki who also has access to wood release, but his wood release pales in comparison to that of Hashirama's. And often a lot of people miscredit Obito for having better wood release than he even actually has, because a false version of Toby appears during the 4th Great Shinobi World War, which is actually just Yamato wrapped up in a white setsu. So with all of this said, do the Akatsuki, while working together, defeat Hashirama in a fight? Well, maybe. See, amongst all of the members of the Akatsuki, there are really only 2 techniques that would be able to kill him with no caveats. And those 2 techniques are the Totsuka Blade and Chibaku Tensai. And yes, maybe if Hidan spent an hour straight stabbing himself in the heart, eventually Hashirama would die, but I'm not gonna consider that a win state. Maybe if Hidan sawed his own head off, Hashirama would die. I don't know. We don't know the boundaries of his regeneration factor. So for the moment, let's say that Chibaku Tensai and the Sword of Totsuka could kill Hashirama. Unfortunately, when it boils down to it, even Chibaku Tensai is kind of a stretch to say that it could kill Hashirama, on account of the fact that an 8-tailed version of Kurama was able to break out of it when Naruto and Nagato were having their battle. And I can tell you right now, Hashirama's true 1,000 hands bodied Staffa is stronger than 8 tails of half of Kurama. His 1,000 hands bodied Staffa is stronger than the entirety of Kurama coded into Susanoo. So Chibaku Tensei probably isn't holding Hashirama down, if we're being honest with ourselves. So there is one move that could kill Hashirama amongst all 10 members of the Akatsuki, and that is the Sword of Totsuka. So could all of the other members of the Akatsuki create an opening for Itachi to seal Hashirama using the Sword of Totsuka? Maybe. The win condition for the Akatsuki is that Obito uses his insane maneuverability and high defenses to draw blood from Hashirama, blood that he then hands over to Hidan. And the idea of Obito being able to draw blood from Hashirama is not all that crazy, especially because Hashirama wouldn't know how the kamui works. Now, after Obito is able to hand this blood over to Hidan, Hidan starts the ritual and starts stabbing himself in vital places, which would, at the absolute very least, slow Hashirama down, to the point where Hashirama could possibly be put in a situation where Deidara would be able to use either C4 or C0 to critically injure Hashirama. And after Hashirama is critically injured by one of the strongest attacks from Deidara, Itachi would be able to swoop in with his rather impressive speed and use the Sword of Totsuka on Hashirama and seal him away in the realm of drunken dreams. However, do I think this win condition is likely? No. So many things would have to go right for the Akatsuki, it is absurd. Toby needs to be able to land a blow on Hashirama, something that is most likely unlikely. Then after landing a blow on Hashirama, Toby needs to be able to warp over to Hidan, get blood to Hidan without Hashirama stepping in by sending something like a wood clone to stop him. Hidan needs to be able to do his ritual undisturbed. He needs to stay within the confines of his blood circle, because Hidan's ritual doesn't work unless he's inside of his blood circle, and his blood circle can't be broken by something like, oh, I don't know, wood release, and therefore Hidan has to be so far away that Hashirama can't get his hands on him, which would imply that the Akatsuki had some kind of prep time, which they don't in this equation, and therefore the Akatsuki would have to come to the conclusion pretty much as soon as this fight started that Hidan needs to start running away so that Obito can pass off blood to him when Hidan's a couple miles away from Hashirama. Then you're asking for one of the greatest sensors in the Naruto universe who's able to detect people's power signatures from literal countries away to not immediately hone in on the location of Hidan and use his top 10 in the universe speed to close the distance between himself and Hidan and wipe out Hidan before he's able to inflict any more damage. Then Itachi has to get within, I don't know, 10 or 15 feet of Hashirama to use his Totsuka blade on him, but there's one problem. Hashirama has the ability to put himself 10,000 feet in the air on top of something with 1,000 goddamn arms, one of which would be enough to delete Itachi Susanoo from existence. I mean, we're talking about a battle between a group that was only able to catch 7 out of the 9-tailed beasts while working together versus a man who was able to capture 8 out of the 9-tailed beasts, and it was only 8 because one of them was already captured by himself. Hashirama has made jutsus that members of the Akatsuki could only dream of pulling off look insignificant. He wins rather easily. However, if you did run this match, let's say 10 or so times, the Akatsuki would win 1 or 2 of those times. It's not that certain members of the Akatsuki aren't able to scale rather close to Hashirama, it's just that they have no way to kill him, and that Hashirama has many ways to kill all of them. However, I'm curious to hear from you guys. In this 1v10, who do you think comes out victorious? Let me know in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, Dorothy is alone at our new house talking to people about what windows we want, and I need to tap around.